Hello. This week, it's time to talk why finance professionals are also becoming podcasters. Welcome to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. From the heart of London's financial district, I'm Kyle Hannon, and this is a podcast from the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, AICPA and CIMA. And this week, we're talking to David Spray. He's based in Texas. He's a former CPA and podcaster. He's a serial entrepreneur who recently started a pair of projects which caught our interests. So this week, our episode is entitled, It's Time to Talk, Why Finance Professionals Are Also Becoming Podcasters. David launched his first podcast just 2 years ago and a second podcast earlier this year. He is a person who knows the accounting profession well. He received a BBA in accounting from the University of Texas in 1987 and an MBA from the University of Houston in 1991. So, David, welcome to the podcast. Where are you joining us from today?
Good morning, Kyle. I'm joining you from Houston, Texas.
So that means you're about, 5 or 6 hours behind us here in the UK?
6, I believe.
And I hope you're having better weather here. It's 12 degrees and raining. You are someone who is, very much like I am, a fan of podcasting. And we always like to talk about how technologies can transform businesses, especially in times of disruption. And there's been a lot of buzz about podcasting, a lot of attention online being paid to it. We'll be talking about why that's important for practices, why perhaps they should consider starting a podcast, and what they can get out of it. So we're here to talk about why finance professionals are also becoming podcasters. Now, David, let's start with you. How did you get from being a CPA to becoming a podcaster?
My primary business is called Export Advisors, and we specialize in a very narrow part of the U.S. tax code. The program is called an IC-DISC, IC-DISC, and it's a program to encourage privately held U.S. companies to do more exporting. Most of the industrialized nations have these type of export incentives. And I've done this about 15 years, and we've helped hundreds of companies save a few $100 million in taxes. Over time, I realized that my primary job was really education, because the program benefits so few companies that most CPAs and even the end users were just not familiar with it. So my job was really education. And I've been an avid podcast listener for years. And I started thinking that podcasting could be a great platform to amplify that educational message. And that's what prompted me to start it a couple of years ago.
Right. So your latest business, this company called Your Podcast Team, that's the one that brought you to our attention. Tell us a little bit about what's happening there.
On my original podcast, we've had, a couple dozen guests now. We do about one episode a month. And at the end, almost every guest would say something like, boy, that's great. You have a podcast. I wish I had a podcast. I would always encourage them. Yeah, you really should have one. Start one. I'm happy to help. Call me with any questions. But nobody actually started one. And so I had this hypothesis that it was because it was too overwhelming, too complex. And so I sent an email out a few months ago to 3 of my guests and said, hey, if we did a podcast for you, if we did everything and all you had to do was call into a recorded line and do an interview and that's it, would you be interested? 2 of the 3 said yes on the spot. 1 said maybe. And Your Podcast Team was born. And so that was the genesis for it. And then I thought that a podcast to support Your Podcast Team made sense. So the newest podcast is called Podcasting Stories. And this is really geared toward people who are contemplating starting a podcast, but they're not quite sure if they have what it takes or the challenges. And so our guests are either other people who are considering starting a podcast, and we talk through kind of some of their concerns or questions, or people who have recently started a podcast and we see how that's going, or veteran podcasters such as yourself where they can share kind of war stories. And speaking of which, I would love to have you as a guest on there if your schedule should allow, as one of our veteran examples of a podcaster.
I must say that is the first time I've been invited onto a podcast. I spent so much time talking to people about themselves. It's going to feel a bit strange being on the other side of the conversation, even though I will still be on the same side of the same microphone. But that would be delightful. And I think that also tells us something about why turning the conversation around is sometimes for many people quite a leap, but you don't do it unless it's something which brings your business a benefit. So tell us about your journey from being a CPA to becoming a podcaster. You wouldn't have done that unless it had benefited your businesses. You started with your first podcast and then the second one launched to support the second business activity. How have they supported or reinforced or changed how your businesses have been running?
So for the original podcast around the tax incentives, there were so many benefits to it. And literally, I keep discovering new ones. Some of them were for longtime clients. It was a way to further enhance the relationship. When you have somebody as a guest on your podcast, our podcasts tend to be longer than yours. They're more like 45 minutes to an hour. I listen to Tim Ferriss and a lot of other long form podcasters. So for me, a 45-minute to hour podcast feels a bit abbreviated. But when you have a client on and you can showcase them for an hour, tell their story, put them in the most positive light possible, and then publicly thank them for being a great client to 8 billion potential worldwide listeners, that really enhances the relationship in a way that I would have never expected. Another benefit are we've had some really pretty famous people on the original podcast, well-known authors and other business leaders who I would have probably had trouble getting a 15-minute interview with them. But when you invite them to be on the podcast, their schedule is suddenly free for half the afternoon, if that's what it takes. And then the third one is just when I'm talking to a potential customer and I'm trying to convey that we are the expert in this area. And to further that point, I can say, oh, and by the way, if you'd like to learn more about my philosophy or strategy or hear from some of our other clients, I have a podcast on the IC Disc and it's called The IC Disc Show. It's just really amazing when you have a niche and you are the proclaimed expert in that niche and you have a podcast in that niche that has the name of your niche in the podcast. It's a tremendous differentiator.
Is this the sort of potential benefit that you're hearing sounds attractive to the finance professionals that you're talking to? I mean, what are you hearing from accountants and CPAs and finance pros about why they're considering getting into podcasting? I mean, some have obviously started as listeners. Now they're considering becoming actual podcasters. What are they telling you about why that is?
Yeah, I think for some of the same reasons that they are looking to have a platform to be able to reach more people in a more engaging fashion. I recently read a stat somewhere that the average YouTube video engagement is less than a minute, but the average podcast episode is like more than 10 minutes. And so I think that's one of the things that people find appealing is that because the listeners tend to listen longer, they have the opportunity to make a deeper connection with the listener. And then I think there's a lot of other reasons that people don't even think about that when I tell them about it, it really kind of gets the gears turning. And we have an educational piece called The 50 Benefits to Having a Podcast. And I find that just when you share that, it really opens people's eyes as to some of the benefits to having a podcast are.
We'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes and make sure we put a link to that in our podcast show notes. And you're quite right about the potential that people see in podcasting, certainly within our professional community. Here at AICPA and CIMA, the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, we already make over a half dozen regular weekly podcast shows, and more of those are on the cards. Some of them include the Personal Financial Planning, the PFP podcast. Another episode of that came out this week. Our episodes of Go Beyond Disruption are weekly. We've got the Small Firm Philosophy. ones like our CPA town halls that we put out. Then, of course, there's the Journal of Accountancy podcast and the FM magazine podcast as well. All of those coming out regularly. And we know that this is an incredibly useful way of connecting with people when they'll be otherwise engaged. They may be exercising or driving or doing things which don't require sitting in front of a computer or looking at a screen, because people sometimes like to watch, they like to read, they sometimes like to listen. Obviously, these are different ways of connecting with people in all sorts of ways where they are. So where would podcasting stand in comparison to all those other ways of connecting with our audiences or our customers and our wider networks? I mean, why is podcasting getting so much attention at the moment? What's the big disruption here?
Well, I think it's because podcasts are the rarest form of online content. I mean, with just some rough numbers, there's about 50 billion YouTube videos. There's a couple billion websites. There's 600 million blogs. But as far as iTunes, kind of the main directory of podcasts, there's less than 2 million. And of those 2 million, most of those have not released an episode in the last 90 days. And of the ones who have released an episode in the last 90 days, only a fraction of those, about a quarter, have actually broken the 10-episode barrier. So we tell people that if you launched a podcast today and you did one episode a month for 10 months, you basically would be in the top 25% of all of the podcasts on iTunes.
Yeah, let's talk a bit more about why that is so important. And you're quite right to point out people will be familiar with Apple iTunes. Recently, they changed the home of all their podcasts now to the Apple Podcasts directory. And as you point out, that does have around 2 million different podcasts on it. That's not episodes, that is different shows. All right. So there are also millions and millions of podcasts hosted elsewhere which aren't available on the Apple Podcasts directory. And in total worldwide, according to some sources, there are closer to 4 million different podcasts, different shows out there. But as you say, only a small portion of those release regular episodes. In fact, if you look at the 4 million podcasts, something like perhaps 250,000, maybe 250,000 or so, have released episodes just in the last 2 weeks. So that means that even though there does seem to be a lot out there, it's the consistency and the regularity of it which really will make you stand out. And I think it makes sense to an accountant. I mean, no accountant is going to call themselves an accountant just because they did a tax return once a year. You've got to do it regularly. We've all heard of the concept of month end. That's what makes you an accountant, a finance professional, doing it consistently and regularly. And I'm sure our audience would not think of doing it in any other way. And just to give you a sense of how things are becoming more and more focused on podcasting and audio, Facebook just recently, and we're recording this in May 2021, Facebook has just introduced support for podcast playing inside Facebook itself. And this is huge, especially because they're doing it in partnership with Spotify. So clearly a fast-moving area and much more so, as you say, Dave, recently. So I just want to have a quick look at how things have changed. And it's about some of the basics that may have stayed just as relevant as when you first started doing your podcast. Back in about 2018, which is, I think, in summer 2018, that's the middle of the year for us here in the Northern Hemisphere, one of our association publications, the Journal of Accountancy, who have their own website and, of course, their own podcast, they published 10 Steps to Start Your Own CPA Podcast. It was by Lou Carlozo, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Now, of course, this is just a brief breakdown of what he may have been talking about. They said pick a comfortable, quiet place to record and edit, pick the right mic, get good earphones, learn your way around some basic free recording software, consider recruiting a podcast producer. Now, that is the fifth point he made, which I think brings us right back to what you do, Dave. So we'll talk about that more. Learn how to record interviews, practice your podcast diction. Having a conversation is not the same as hosting a show. To start, keep it brief. Be patient with yourself, learn as you go. Most of all, have fun and be interesting. Okay, so that was out summer 2018 on the Journal of Accountancy blog. So let's look at how things may have changed since then. You've heard, I've run through the list. What do you think still holds true, and what do you think people now in 2021 need to be doing that we may not have been talking about back in 2018?
Well, I think there's three things that I think are still the same, and they're pretty timeless. Have a quiet place, learning as you go, and have fun and be interesting. I think the big shift that has happened is that there's been more of a shift from DIY to DFY. And by that, I mean from a do-it-yourself mindset to a done-for-you mindset. And when you look through that list, most of those are relevant if you are trying to do the podcast yourself and really kind of manage everything. And what we've discovered is that the challenge with that, and even though that list is all accurate, we find that 95% of the people who intend to start a podcast never actually launch. And I think it's because they get sidetracked with the technological complexity and just the other complexity of it. And so our approach is really a simpler approach that says, hey, a good enough podcast is better than a perfect podcast that never gets released. And so our approach is saying, hey, don't, at this point in your podcast career to get started, don't worry about the microphone and post-production and that. We have a simpler approach that says, hey, let's use a recorded call-in line. All your guests know how to use a phone. Call in, treat it like a live radio show. So there's no editing unless there's a technological issue. You finish it. We'll do everything behind the scenes. And will the call quality be as good as an NPR show? No. But will the average listener even notice? We don't think so. And so the idea is that let's at least get started with something that's good enough, because one of the suggestions they make in that list is to just get started and you'll get better over time. And so that's kind of the biggest difference, I would say. And it's maybe not a time evolution as much as it is just a philosophy evolution.
That's exactly right. Because just as you say, there's the swing from DIY, do it yourself, to DFY. Because podcasting did start as very much kind of a make our own content and put it out there. And more these days, especially as the big music streaming services are coming on board and supporting podcasting, for example, Spotify, they acquired a do-it-yourself podcasting tool called Anchor, and they make it very easy for people to make their own podcasts. Facebook's going to be doing a record your own podcast tool as well, I hear. That is something which more and more people are doing. But the problem is, because they make it so easy to do it yourself, people do go off and make a couple of test episodes, and then they stop. And as a result, that's why the majority of podcasts online are essentially dormant. They are not active. So the difference is when someone actually comes in and says, okay, you've clearly got enough interest to start doing it for yourself, but moving over from the DIY to the done for you, the DFY, means that someone is then going to make sure you stay on track and keep putting that stuff out and don't just become another dormant podcast. And I think that is a very, very important shift at the moment. This is the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. You can find out more about the work we do and the episodes we make, and we've made over 150 of them by going to gobeyonddisruption.com. It's a podcast from AICPA and CIMA, and you can get those episodes just by searching online on your favorite podcast app or wherever you get your music. Just search for Go Beyond Disruption podcast. Remember to put AICPA in there as well, and that just makes sure that you can listen to the episodes absolutely free whenever you like. Dave, what are you hearing from CPAs about why they are considering having a podcast, and do they have any reservations about getting started? You're having the conversations. What are they telling you?
One is that they wonder, will I have enough guests? Two, will I be able to release at least one episode per month for the foreseeable future? And then three is, it just seems so overwhelming. Where do I start?
What do you tell them? Let's start with that first one. Will I be able to have enough guests? What's your answer to that?
Well, we say, let's start by just coming up with a list of 20 people who you believe would be guests. And we actually recommend, really as a first step before you do anything else, just reach out to those 20 people. Tell them you're considering starting a podcast and you would like them to be one of the first guests. Are they interested? So that's a good starting point.
Okay. I will have some more questions about that because I'm already making notes about what the rest of my calendar needs to look like. The other question, will they be able to release at least one episode per month for the foreseeable future? Now, I know we put them out weekly. There are many podcasts which go out daily. There are some which go out with no preset schedule, which are still incredibly popular. So if someone says, hey, Dave, will I be able to make at least one episode a month? What do you tell them?
Again, it goes back to the guest number, that if you reach out to 20 potential guests, we would expect at least 15 would say yes. So that covers you for the first 15 months. So then it's just a matter of getting those guests on your calendar and their calendar and being able to carve out 45 minutes to do that. So roughly, if they can commit an hour a month, they can be off and running for the first year.
And then they question about overwhelm. They say, well, there's a lot to get my head around. Where do I start? Where do they start?
Well, if our answer, of course, is a little bit self-serving, you might say, but we say, well, hey, hire us and you don't have to worry about the rest of the details. That's the DFY, the done for you approach.
Yes, I have a car. I suppose I could learn to fix it, but I just want to drive, so I'm quite happy to pay someone else to fix the car for me. I'm quite used to that. So the done for you makes perfect sense. One thing that we cannot get someone else to do for us is speak on our behalf. So as a finance professional, an accountant who hasn't done this kind of thing before, when you consider starting a podcast, and this is audio, how does someone who's never done this before find and then develop their own voice?
I would say the most important thing is just to be yourself. Let your authentic personality come through, and then focus on what makes each guest interesting. I think that's the key. I heard somebody once say, talk about yourself for 5 minutes and people quickly grow bored. Let them talk about themselves and they'll talk for hours. I think it's the same thing. If you have interesting guests and you find the parts of their story that are interesting, everything else kind of takes care of itself.
And let's focus on the voice, why your own voice is even more important in the business sphere. There's a lot of new buzz about using voices online right now, especially in professional communities like LinkedIn and others. There's a lot of discussion about live social audio platforms, which are being used by some incredibly high-profile people, and they're attracting really big audiences, massive engagements in a kind of new-ish way. And I say new-ish because this isn't actually that new. It's just kind of the latest reincarnation of something that's, comes around every couple of years. Now, the new apps, though, are getting a lot of attention. Apps like Clubhouse, that's been used by people like Elon Musk. There's tech entrepreneur investor Mark Cuban, who's launched something called Fireside. You've got Twitter, who've now launched their own live audio platform called Spaces. Even LinkedIn is reportedly going to be doing similar stuff sometime very soon. So this is all happening now, and professionals have to be aware of it. They have to be paying attention to it, and then they need to be using it to earn attention. So that's why this is something that people are taking seriously, and it should be. And this is a global thing. Dave, how would accounting professionals or any professional start getting used to earning more attention? How could they earn attention by using podcasting?
Well, one of the biggest benefits we see with a podcast is the average finance professional we talk to who has their own firm, and we ask them, how frequently do you send emails to your database? And the typical answer is rarely. And when we drill down, they say the reason is they want to err to the side of under-communication, not over-communication. And we can appreciate that. And we find that having a podcast, and again, even if you start with just once a month, that now you've gone from rarely emailing your database to now at least once a month you're touching them. And we find that a simple 2-paragraph text-only type email, no fancy graphics, just announcing the podcast with a little summary of what was discussed, we find that to be very effective as a way to increase their reach.
And what about confidence? People get used to a lot of new stuff when making audio podcasts. So what would some of those essential first steps be?
Well, I think it's really just a case of just being comfortable with who you are and putting the focus on your guest. I know I've already said that, but I think that's really the foundation, that if you just are yourself and you're genuinely interested in your guest, and your guests are engaged, that I think everything else really just kind of takes care of itself.
And once the content is taken care of, what about the practicalities? Because you talked about making a list of potential guests, making sure that you are committing to yourself to do an episode per month. You know who the guests will be. You have a sense of what the narratives and the themes will be. So you kind of know what you're going to be talking about. You're comfortable with that. Then you've got to get the recording going. You've got to make the podcast. So what are some tips when it comes to the practicalities of that?
One of the tips is that we say that for at least the first 3 episodes, to space the recordings at least a week apart. I mean, in general, we like when somebody releases their first podcast to have at least 2 to 3 other episodes, quote, in the can. And, but we don't recommend like recording all of those like in the same day. So we recommend having at least a week's gap because that allows time to kind of digest and learn. And then we also recommend for at least the first 3 episodes to re-listen to the episodes carefully, take notes. It's a scary proposition because most people don't like the sound of their own voice, and you'll cringe at how many times you say and you talk over your guests. But that's the only way to get better. And so we find if somebody will just do that for even just the first 3 episodes, that they can make really significant progress.
You did earlier mention that you've got a couple of self-assessment tools which are worth sharing, and I'd love to dip into some of those when we talk about resources that we'd recommend. But I know I did mention the Journal of Accountancy blog article from 2018, those 10 tips for starting a podcast. We'll link to that, of course, but that is from about 2.5 years ago. The updated information Dave can share we'll be linking to as well. We'll chat about that in a second. We've made a couple of episodes about podcasting here on the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. Episode 128, we looked at Canada's CPA firms, how they're using podcasting. Episode 77, we talked about accounting podcasters, digital mindsets. And episode 14 was one of our first discussions with an accounting and business culture expert. She's an author and a podcaster, Julie Ann Sullivan. Those are 3 episodes that we have already focused on podcasting in, and this will now be the 4th. So I'm glad we can now talk about where to go next. Dave, you talked about the 50 benefits of having a podcast. Where can people find out more about that? Yeah,
so they can go to our website, yourpodcast.team, not .com, but .team, yourpodcast.team/50 benefits, and that's 50 benefits, the digits. And that's where they can find the 50 benefits.
I, as a finance professional, an accounting pro, I need to look at myself and try to figure out whether or not I'm a good candidate to begin podcasting. There must be something you can suggest for people there.
Well, it's funny you mention that, Kyle. We have an assessment scorecard, and that can be found at yourpodcastscore.com. And it's 8 questions. It takes about 5 minutes to complete. And at the end of it, you'll have a pretty good idea if you are a good candidate for having a podcast, at least at this point.
All right. So they can just go to yourpodcastscore.com, and that will give you a self-assessment. I think that is something which gives any tax professional a bit of a headache when someone says, I've self-assessed. And you go, no, perhaps not. Maybe you need a professional to look at this. But okay, so we'll link to that, the 50 benefits to having a podcast. That's at your podcast team/50 benefits. And the scorecard, 8 questions in which you can self-assess whether or not you're a good candidate for a podcast to become a podcaster. That's your podcastscore.com. Dave, while we're on the subject of links, what would you say to someone who wants to connect with you and the work you do? Where should they look for you online or perhaps in real life on the ground now that we can start meeting up for real as the lockdown starts to ease in our part of the world? What have you got coming up in the next few months? Where can people find you online? Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not a power LinkedIn user by any means. Probably the best place to keep up with me is the new podcast, Podcasting Stories, which is at podcastingstories.com, or they could just search on their podcast player of choice. If they just search by my name, David Spray, S-P-R-A-Y, it's a relatively unique name, and so that'll pull up just my 2 podcasts. In that one, we're on a weekly release cadence,
And so if they want to kind of keep up with what's going on, that's it. And then for the summer, I'll be in Colorado. So if they're going to be in Colorado, just shoot me a note. And dspray@exportadvisors.com is the email address. And just shoot me a note, and love to catch up and maybe go for a hike.
Good. Well, as the weather improves, time for a T-shirt. We ask all our guests to imagine their own virtual Go Beyond Disruption T-shirt. So if you were to get one printed and you put one sentence on the front which delivered a simple message for our listeners to take away from the conversation today, what would that T-shirt say?
Well, it would be a bit long for a T-shirt, but I think you'll get the idea. I would say we've all heard the saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the next best time is today. I think the same thing applies to a podcast. The best time to launch a podcast would have been 5 years ago, but the next best time is today.
Thank you so much. My guest, David Spray, who joined us from Houston to talk about why finance professionals are also becoming podcasters. You can find links to everything we mentioned in the show notes in your podcast player. You can also open the podcast online and you'll see the notes right there. We are aware that there are some podcast apps that don't display the links correctly. If you can't see the links, just use another podcast app or go online and search for it there, and the links should be absolutely fine. If you want to find out more about the podcast, go to gobeyonddisruption.com. That is gobeyonddisruption.com. Episodes every week looking at technologies and intelligences, that's human and technological, which help us as professionals to go beyond disruption. From the heart of the City of London, I'm Kyle Hannon. And until next time, keep listening and keep safe. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-cima.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.